I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Stephan A. Schwartz, an internationally known researcher in the field of extraordinary human functioning. He's an award-winning author of both fiction and nonfiction, columnist for the journal Explore, editor of the Schwartzreport daily web publication, and writes regularly for the Huffington Post. Stephan is a distinguished associated scholar for the California Institute of Human Science, consulting faculty of Saybrook University, a BIAL Foundation Fellow, a senior Samueli Insitute Fellow, founder and research director of the Mobius Laboratory, director of research at the Rhine Research Center, and senior fellow of the Philosophical Research Society. Stephan's government experience includes past work as a special assistant for research and analysis to the Chief of Naval Operations and consultant to the oceanographer of the Navy. So Stephan, welcome, sir. Thank you for joining me.
My pleasure, Tim.
So today we're talking about non-local consciousness, and actually Russell Targ sent me your way. I did an interview with him, and he'd said, you really want to talk to Stephan Schwartz about this, and non-local consciousness is where it's at. So conceptually, this emerges from your experience in remote viewing. And as I understand things, Ingo Swann actually taught you the RV technique, right? Can you kind of start?
No.
Okay. Well, can you start out by telling us? Can you start out by telling us a little bit about your background and experience, I guess, in this area?
Well, I got into this way a decade before SRI even existed, and as a result of reading all of the Edgar Cayce readings.
Okay.
I woke up when I was just 24 years old, and that's a whole long story. And I was introduced to the Edgar Cayce material through a odd set of circumstances. And I went down and read it and was so impressed with what I saw that I decided to read all of them. There are about 15,000. And I read all of the Edgar Cayce readings, and then I thought, well, I better start reading what science knows about this. So I read every parapsychological journal that had been published at that time. I started in '64, and it took me about 4 years. And in 1968, I began doing experiments with what I called distant viewing.
Okay.
Now, both terms, by the way, are dreadful. I didn't meet Ingo or the SRI guys until 1977, almost a decade later. But I started doing these experiments because Cayce had said that anybody or most people could do this. And also, when I had been at university, I'd been an Eccles Scholar at the University of Virginia, which is a special program. I had read Herodotus's Histories of the World, and the oldest recorded remote viewing, what today we would call an outbound protocol, the oldest recorded remote viewing we have in history from the 5th century BCE is in the 46th chapter of Herodotus's Histories of the World. Herodotus is considered the father of history, and his book, The History of the World, is considered to be the first historical text. And he describes basically a remote viewing.
Okay.
So I realized that people had been doing this for thousands of years. What we did, myself, the SRI guys, and the Pear Institute Princeton lab, what we did was create a series of protocols, ways of doing it that could irrefutably be said to be triple blind, so that you couldn't know the answer, nobody knew the answer, that kind of thing. You selected the target after you did the viewing, whatever. But, or in my case, I got, the difference between myself and most other researchers was that most research begins from the premise, is this real?
Yeah.
Does this stuff really exist? And because I had spent so many years, I read, as I say, not only the Casey material and everything that had been published in parapsychology, and also, Steiner, Blavatsky, Bailey, I don't know, all of the sort of consciousness researchers from the late 19th, early 20th century, Carl Jung. I didn't have any question about whether it was real or not. What I wanted to know was, A, what did it tell us about being a human being? What was it telling us about the role and nature of consciousness? Could you do anything of practical utility with it? And how could you improve the results that you got? So those were my questions. My interest from the beginning was not about whether it was real. I knew it was real. It was a question of, as I say, how could you make it better? What could you do that was of practical utility? And what was it telling us about being a human being and the matrix of what I came to think of as the matrix of consciousness? So, in any case, in my backyard, I had a garden. I was living in Virginia Beach. I got a bunch of yellow rope and I laid out a grid of 12 squares. And I would bury mason jars or 35 millimeter film canisters, for people who are old enough to remember those, and in one of the grids, and then I would I had a mimeograph copy of the grid, and I would send it out to people all over the world and say, I've buried something in one of the grids. Can you tell me which grid I've picked? And can you tell me what's in the grid? And eventually it became 144 squares because a friend who was a statistician told me it'd be even more impressive if I made more squares. It actually didn't make any difference. But in any case, I discovered that there was I guess you would call it, not I guess, a bell curve to this. That is, there were a few people who were really, really good at it. I met in 1973, I was introduced to a guy named George McMullen, who was a Chrysler parts manager at a Chrysler dealership up in Nanaimo, Canada. And he was just amazing. You can go to my website, StephanASchwartz.com, and watch him on film locate a buried building in the middle of a desert. So, I mean, this guy was really quite good. And Fran Farley, a woman who was down in Florida. Anyway, I met a bunch of folk who could, in the course of doing this, and it turned out, as I looked at the statistics, about 12% of people, and this turned out to has been subsequently validated, about 12% of people are quite good at this. A similar number is just don't seem to get it, can't get it. They tend to be highly analytical. They have trouble sort of conceptualizing or imagining things. And most people are somewhere in the middle of the bell curve. Anyway, so I did this experiment for months, years actually, as long as I lived in Virginia Beach, and as I say, it got to be 144 squares, and I would bury things like my wife's perfume bottle, or a vegetable peeler, to peel cucumbers, or sponges, just all kinds of stuff. And I would send out this mimeograph form of which depicted the grid, and ask people to locate it and describe it. And I found out they could do it. And that a certain number of them, as I said, could do it quite well. And that's really how I got into this. Okay. And then I began to think about what are the implications of this? What is it telling us? Because it became clear to me very early that it had nothing to do with space. People who were in other countries, I was working with a guy in Italy, for instance, and another one in Germany. And they did it just as well as people who were, down the street from me.
Yeah.
So
Well,
distance didn't matter and time didn't matter. That was the other thing.
yeah, and that was actually I wanted to jump in on that because so this term, this idea of non-local consciousness, this is really saying that the conscious experience of the mind, it's not necessarily tied to our body, and it operates independently of these constraints of space and time, right? And again, that was one of the things
Yeah.
when Russell Targ recommended you, he'd said that has kind of been the focus of Stephan's work in many ways. So
Yes. Well, where you get with this, Tim, after a while, I mean, you start out just doing these studies, or that's what I did. But then I began to think, as I said, about, first of all, I conceptualized the matrix of consciousness because as I read the literature of what other people were doing, I realized that it that conscious intention could get could allow people to influence the physical well-being of other organisms for good or ill, and that's important. And I also began to realize I got introduced to Ian Stevenson's, who was doing and now Tim. I can't think of his last name. Tim.
yeah.
No, not. Anyway, I'll think of it in a second. I met Ian, and he really got me thinking about the idea of the continuity of consciousness. That is, consciousness existing prior to incarnation, during incarnation, and then subsequently after physical death. I had witnessed, when I was 12 years old, I had witnessed a near-death experience. My dad was an anesthesiologist, and in those days, I mean, you couldn't do this anymore, but in those days, as a kind of recruitment program, the doctors, you could go with your father on Saturday when you weren't in school and scrub up and sit behind him as long as you didn't touch anything or say anything.
Okay.
And so at one point I was scrubbed up and went in, and the patient was already on the table, and I couldn't really see who it was. And then they started, and my dad and the other doctors, and then all of a sudden they went into this kind of controlled, not panic, but this kind of controlled crisis management situation, and they took off the towels, that they cover the body with, and I could see that it was a young woman, a teenage girl, and of course I'm 12 years old, so I could see her breasts, and you're totally focused on that, right? And I watched this process, and I couldn't figure out what they were doing. They were pushing on her chest, and anyway, after a little while, they kind of calmed down, and I still couldn't figure out what was going on, and you couldn't say anything. And my dad had her. They took her off the operating table and put her on a gurney and took her into the recovery room. They didn't do the surgery, and after a little while, I scrubbed up. I got showered and got back in my regular clothes, and as I was doing that, my dad came in and had this very odd look on his face and didn't say anything. But we got in the car, and in those days, the doctors all went on Saturday. They went to this delicatessen where they sat around a table at the back, and my dad went in, and one of the doctors said, "Well, Abe, what happened?" And he said, "Well, she when her heart quit beating, she said that she woke up and she was out of her body." Now you can imagine this is in the early 50s, and she was out of her body, and she went. No, none of us would listen. She was calling, and none of us would react. So she went out into the hallway, and she saw a nurse and described the nurse's hairdo, which she particularly liked, and said she was flirting with a doctor who had a blue and white striped shirt and whose tie was not pulled up properly but was partway down,
Mm.
which in those days was not the way you did it. And my father said, and I went out into the hallway, and there was the nurse that she described. I could tell from the hairdo. And as I was talking to her, this young resident came by who had a blue and white shirt and his tie pulled down. And he said, so clearly something, she was dead, but she wasn't. And they went around this table. These guys were all World War II vets. And of course, they'd seen combat and all that for all those years of the Second World War. And one by one, they each had a story similar to that. And as we were driving home, I said to my father, I don't understand it. She was dead, but she was conscious. And he said, well, science is as much an art as a science. And we're learning things, but we don't know everything.
Well, so let me jump in there, because one of the things, and I know that there are subsequent experiments with this, to the best of your knowledge, this is not an electromagnetic phenomena, right?
Yes. Yes. Do you want me to address that?
Yeah, because I understand that there was work done remote viewing a submarine, right? And this would also go to, I believe this would also go to the NDE experience, because I think, conventionally they would view this as basic electrical impulses and ion flows in the brain. But if it's not an electromagnetic phenomenon, then that wouldn't explain it, right?
Exactly. Okay. Now the story, that what you're referring to is my experiment called Deep Quest.
Mm.
In 1973, I was the special assistant to the Chief of Naval Operations. And everybody, well, not everybody, but many people knew of my interest in consciousness, my research about consciousness. And a friend of mine was the head of the CIA, a guy named Stan Turner, Admiral Turner. And he began to send me translations of papers that the CIA somehow got hold of, I don't know how, and of a man named Leonid Vasiliev. And Vasiliev was a physician, researcher in what is today St. Petersburg, then Leningrad. And he was tasked by the Soviet Politburo, the group that ran the Soviet Union, to do research on is consciousness entirely physiologically based. And he wrote a book eventually, by the way, that Russell Targ published as part of a set of books that he did. But in those days, this was all highly classified.
Yeah.
And anyway, Stan Turner sent me this stuff, and I read Vasiliev would put people down into mine shafts, and he would put people down into caves, and he'd put them in Faraday cages, which block electromagnetic radiation in the Faraday cages and in the caves and in the mines and all that. And he would ask them to do tasks that they could not do, that you couldn't explain materially.
Okay.
And people did it. And he was a very methodical researcher, Vasiliev. And he gradually eliminated the entire electromagnetic spectrum, except ELF, extreme low frequency electromagnetic radiation, 3 to 300 hertz. And he went to Admiral Gorshkov, who was the father of the Soviet Blue Water Navy. And he didn't write about this, but I learned this from the CIA guys. And he went to Admiral Gorshkov and asked Gorshkov if he could put somebody in a submarine and do these experiments, because seawater at depth is the only way to shield from ELF. And that was the last little piece of the EM spectrum that he hadn't been able to eliminate. And for whatever reason, I don't know why, I never learned, Gorshkov wouldn't do it.
Mm.
And so at that point, I was with the CNO, and I flew up to Groton, Connecticut, with Hyman Rickover, the father of the American nuclear navy. And I asked Rickover if he would let me do this experiment that Vasiliev had tried to do but been unable to do. We were going up to see the launch of a nuclear submarine. And I said to him, would you let me go aboard the sub during the sea trials and get some of the sailors to do this, standard. Now, the other thing which was going on, which very few people seem to understand this, is that a story emerged in the media that the American government had done an experiment using this submarine Nautilus, the first nuclear submarine in the world, and that they had done these experiments while people were submerged in the submarine. And the Soviets got wind of that and thought, oh my goodness, the Americans are doing something, we need to do it too. And they started set up a parapsychological lab. Now, the irony of this is that this experiment never happened. Although people write about it as happening all the time, it never happened. It was created by a Dutch journalist who wrote it up in a book. He just made it up. I later talked to him about it. He just made it up. And then an American journalist picked it up and he wrote it up and repeated it because he thought it actually happened. In any case, the Americans then heard that the Soviets had set up this lab, and that's what created the SRI lab, because they said, oh, well, if the Russians are doing it, then we better do it too. But in any case, we flew up to Groton, and I asked Rickover if he would do this. And he said, well, let me think about it. And the idea that I had initially was that you could make an association because of the experiments that I had done in the 60s with the grid. I knew that people were very good at describing sense impressions, colors, smells, sounds, that kind of thing, but they weren't very good at getting analytical information, names, numbers. And so I thought, well, you could create an association. And one day I was at the Library of Congress doing research for a speech I was writing for Admiral Zumwalt. And I came across the story and a picture done by Lord Nelson when he fought the Battle of the Nile with Admiral Bruyer, the French admiral. A famous battle. It was fought in Abu Qir Bay, and this was fought, we're talking about the 17th century, 18th century. In those days, these wooden ships of the line, which had 65 cannon, they all fired black powder. These are all charged with black powder, and it created terrible smoke. And so Lord Nelson had his ships strung out across Abu Qir Bay, and he realized that as they were strung out over several miles, that where the fighting was taking place, the smoke would get so bad that they couldn't see what was really going on. So he detailed one of his frigates. These are smaller ships, kind of like destroyers would be in modern Navy. And he worked up a system of flags, and I found a picture of the actual code book in which the flags were associated with actions he wanted the captains to do. And that gave me the idea for what I created and then later called associated remote viewing, where you ask somebody to describe, the apple represents one thing and the scissors represents another. Same idea that that Nelson had done when he had the frigate, fly a blue flag with a white stripe. That meant tack left, and if it was a red flag with a black stripe, that meant tack right, that kind of thing. So when I was talking to Rickover, what I had in mind was creating an emergency communications channel between submarines that might be in danger and or that they could get orders that way. And so because I also knew that the Navy had spent about $125 million on a project to figure out how to communicate with the submerged submarines, the nuclear missile submarines, who were part of what's called the triad, of the defense triad, so that the submarines would not have to come to the surface or even anywhere near the surface, because then Soviet satellites could pick up the heat from the nuclear reactors.
Yeah.
So they wanted to keep them submerged, and so they had eliminated all of the electromagnetic spectrum except ELF. In fact, the project was called ELF, and in any case, so I asked Rickover if he would let me do this, because I had in mind solving this problem that the Navy was really wrestling with at that time, and what would happen if you couldn't make a communication. The other thing they learned, which turned out to be very important, was that you could only transmit a very, very small amount of data. That turns out to be very important in this. In fact, if you saw the movie The Quest for Red, or The Search for Red October, they have a scene where they get a message and it's like 1, 2, 3, and what that means is you're supposed to target a particular site. So in that movie, they play that out. In any case, I asked Rickover if he would let me do this, and he said, well, let me think about it, and I'll get back to you. And about, I don't know, a week or 10 days later, he called me up and said, that's an interesting experiment, but inevitably it will leak out and the media will get focused on it, and it'll cause a lot of attention to the nuclear submarines that are going around. Most people don't even know they exist. And we don't need the media coverage. So I'm sorry, but I'm not going to let you do it. So I thought, well, it's never going to happen. So that's 1973. In 76, I got, after I left government in 76, because of Watergate, really. And I knew all the players, and I got to a point where I couldn't tell the good guys from the bad guys. And I thought, I can't do this. What I had been interested in is the transformation of the military. I'm a vet, from the elitist conscription draft military that I had been part of as an enlisted man, to create a all-volunteer meritocracy that was racially and gender neutral. That's what we did. That's what Zumwalt is famous for. And so when that was over, and I had been recruited to go over to the White House to work with National Security Council and for the president. But Nixon put me off so much, and all those people, Haldeman and Ehrlichman and Hunt and all those guys, because I knew them and I couldn't tell the good guys from the bad guys. So I thought, I can't do this. I can't work in a situation where I can't tell the integrity of the people. So I left government. I got this fellowship. I wrote a book called The Secret Vaults of Time, which was about all of the remote viewing prior to my getting involved. And I had also, because I come out of an anthropological background, and I had started with a guy named Joe Long, the Society for what is now the Society for the Anthropology of Consciousness. I took this fellowship that I got offered by Manly Hall at the Philosophical Research Society, and I went out and I stayed with a friend of mine, Don Keach, who had been the deputy director of Navy Labs. And one day we were having lunch, and he said, that crazy submarine experiment you wanted to do? I said, yeah, but where do you get a submarine? And he said, well, as it happens, we have a research submarine coming down to do its sea trials this summer from Canada, from a company called HICO, and we'll pay for 3 days. I'd like to see how that experiment comes out.
Oh, very
And
good.
we'll pay for 3 days. And so that gave me, I mean, where do you get a submarine, right? So that experiment was, first of all, could individuals scattered around the world, if I sent them a map of the ocean, a sea chart, could they locate a previously undiscovered wreck on the seafloor? Because that meant they could penetrate the seawater down to depths beyond what ELF could explain. And secondarily, could I put people in the submarine and ask them to look at where people were hiding on the surface? Because that would go out. So you go into the depth of the ocean and you go out from the depth of the ocean to the surface. And that plus, as I mentioned earlier, the bit rate of transmission, because to describe even a simple form like a square takes about 60 bits of information, and the bit rate for transmission by ELF is like 6 bits. So that's why they could only transmit numbers, and the submarines have books of code books aboard the submarine that say when you get a code of 1, 2, 3, 4, it means target this place or do this particular action. So anyway, Don Keach and another guy named Don Walsh, who was also a friend, who made the deepest dive in history that'll ever be made, Mariana Trench and the Challenger Deep. They had both retired from the Navy and had taken over the Institute of Marine and Coastal Studies at the University of Southern California. And so they made this offer to me that they would pay for 3 days of the sub. And I got the chart, the sea chart. Their facility was on Catalina Island, which is, I don't know, about 14 miles off the coast of Los Angeles, and where the submarine was and where it was doing its sea trials. And so I got a chart, a sea chart from a shop that serviced yachts. And I sent it out to a bunch of people, and I asked them to locate an unknown wreck on the seafloor, which they did. Actually located several, but there was one particularly. I looked for where, by that time I had created something called the Mobius Consensus Protocol, which is a way, it's based really on intelligence work and on investigative journalism, because at one point I was an investigative journalist, where you interview a bunch of people independently, and what you're looking for is where they agree.
Yeah.
So I would get remote viewers who didn't know each other, didn't know about each other, to do this, locate something, and then describe for me what would be there when I got there. And that was pure triple blind, because nobody on Earth knew the answer. So it couldn't possibly be a physiological, a mental, physiologically based consciousness, because that information didn't exist in space-time. I mean, it existed, but it was unknown. So these are triple blind experiments, and I like triple blind experiments. And also because my anthropological background, I knew that one of the big issues in archaeology at that time was where to look, because most things got found serendipitously. That is, a farmer was plowing a field and he turned up a tomb, or a road crew was repairing a road and turned up a temple or whatever. And so the big argument in archaeology was, well, where to look? And it seemed to me that this was a perfect combination, using remote viewing to locate previously unknown archaeological sites and describe what was physically there. So it was perfect triple blind controls, and you could create an absolutely irrefutable chronology of when the predictions were made, and I notarized them. Anyway, so they located the wreck, and by the way, you can go up on my website, Stephan A. Schwartz, and watch the movie. I made a movie of this. I filmed the whole thing. I got Leonard Nimoy, Dr. Spock, to do the narration for me. And they located the ship, and we located it. I had the surface support vessel drop a pinger, that's a radio homing device, so that they went directly over where the remote viewers had described the site, and they dropped this pinger so we could only go to that place. We couldn't accidentally stumble on something else. And I interviewed the team of the Taurus, that was the name of the submarine. They had been cruising those waters for 3 months, and they had seen no wreck anywhere like this. And then the night before we actually did the attempt to locate the wreck, Hala Hamid, who was one of the viewers, I met Ingo Swann in 1977, and he introduced me to the SRI guys. I met Ed May, and because they had an existing relationship between the interviewers and the remote viewers, which I thought, because they were, had a congenial relationship, that would be better than my interviewing them because they didn't know me. So I had literally just met Ingo Swann, who, by the way, coined the term remote viewing. It's a terrible term, by the way. It has nothing to do with remote, it has nothing to do with viewing. But anyway, that's where our understanding was at the time. Anyhow, so I invited Ingo and Hala Hamid to be the remote viewers who would go out with the submarine, and that we would put them at depth and see if they could describe where somebody was hiding on land. And because they had existing friendships with Hal and Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff, I thought, well, they can be the outbound target people. My original idea was to use George and a guy named Alan Vaughn, but George had a co-worker whose wife had a premature delivery of a child, and he took time off, so George couldn't leave and come down, and Alan Vaughn came down with the flu. So I asked Ingo and Hella if they would take their place, and because, as I said, they had an existing relationship, I asked Ed to do the interviews, and I asked Hal and Russ to be the outbound people. Exactly the experiment, by the way, described by Herodotus, which is where I got the idea. And they were able to do it. And the bit rate of transmission that was involved was vastly more than ELF could explain. And so in that way, DeepQuest established that this acquisition of non-locally sourced information was not electromagnetic. That is, there wasn't a sender, a signal, which at that time, this is back in the early 70s, this experiment took place in 77. At that time, everybody was talking about ELF as the transmission. A guy named Michael Persinger had written a paper about it, arguing that was how it worked. And people were also struggling with, how could you get data and all that. Anyway, it all worked, and I made this film about it. And then I was at a dinner party. Linda Evans, who you remember from the Dallas television series, she and a friend of mine were courting, dating. And at a dinner party that she gave, I had just done the DeepQuest experiment. It got a lot of media attention, as you can imagine, and she asked me to explain it at this dinner, which I did. And seated across from me was a surgeon, and he looked very skeptical. And Linda said to this guy, well, what do you think? And he said, I don't believe a word of it. You're making it up. It's not possible. You just got lucky. I don't know, but it's all crap. And I said to him, well, what would convince you? And he said, well, if you could pick a racehorse, the winner of a racehorse, I'd believe that, because everybody knows you can't pick the winners of racehorses. It's a random event. And so I thought, okay, well, all right. And that is how ARV got associated with making money. So I got Hella Hammond to be one of the viewers, and I got the camera woman who had done the film, Nettie Pena, who had never done remote viewing and didn't know anything about it, to be the other viewer. So I had a very experienced viewer and a person who was an utterly naive viewer, and I wanted to compare the difference, if there was any. And so I asked them, I created an association. I had 7 locations in Los Angeles, and each was linked to a particular horse. So we did the 6th race at Hollywood Park on a particular night, as you know, that worked out, and they both picked the 6th horse. And so we bet $2 on the 6th horse, and it won, and we won $14.
There you go.
And we were jumping up and down, and my little 8-year-old daughter was with us, and she said to me, if I was behaving that way, you'd tell me to stop. But in any case, that's how ARV got linked with finances, and then later Russell did an experiment, I did an experiment, and other people have done experiments where they've made significant sums of money.
Well, so Stephan, let me jump in. I have kind of a personal question. So one of the things that I've wondered is the human mind has been evolving for hundreds of millions of years. And language, right, which is how we, communicate. I mean, it's how we communicate. It's symbolic. It's all of those things. That's only like 150,000 to 200,000 years. Do you think that these abilities are suppressed, or do you think that people have difficulty accessing them because they fall outside of language? We use language as this framework, right, for concepts, for symbols, for structures, and I do realize that you can communicate information, with this, but it's one of the things that I've wondered about is this something that's older and you have to go outside of it? You've mentioned that meditation helps people, and I've wondered if that might be part of it also, right? Meditation helps people quiet the mind and potentially stop using language.
Well, language isn't the issue. The key to it, Tim, the key to this whole business is the ability to attain and sustain intention-focused awareness.
Okay.
That's why meditators routinely do better than non-meditators. Because meditation is about attaining and sustaining intentioned awareness so that you can make contact with what in religion they call the still small voice, or the God's voice, or whatever. And in fact, if you look at religion, what you discover is that all religions begin, well, now let's not get into that quite yet. Just to address your question. We know that there has been an awareness of non-local consciousness that goes back to Neanderthal.
Yeah.
We know this because of excavations of sites where they have buried people in ritualized way, and it's clear that they have some sense that there is a continuity of consciousness. Because at its core, all of this stuff that we're talking about is about continuity of consciousness. And very specifically, it's about what Max Planck said in 1931 when he was interviewed by the Observer newspaper. Planck was the father of quantum mechanics, and a reporter from the Observer newspaper in England, London, went up to him and asked for an interview, and he agreed. And Planck was not a guy that gave a lot of interviews, so that was a big deal for this guy, the reporter. And he said, "My editor has asked me to ask you one question. You and Einstein are the most famous scientists in the world. What have you learned?" And I think what he thought he was going to get was an explanation about molecules and atoms and something like that. I don't know. But in any case, what he got, which is extremely relevant to what we're talking about, is Planck said, what I have learned is that consciousness is causal and fundamental. You cannot get behind consciousness. Space-time arises from consciousness, not consciousness from space-time. Now think about that for a minute. What that is saying is that what we call reality is a construct of consciousness. So when you begin to think that way, and you begin to realize that consciousness is causal and fundamental, as Planck said, and Einstein, by the way, agreed, and so did Pauli and Schrödinger and Heisenberg, and all of those Olympians we describe as the fathers of modern physics. They all didn't start out that way, but they all came to recognize that consciousness was causal, and that space-time is a construct of consciousness. So what we're really dealing with is information and consciousness. And the two great mystery questions, and I don't have an answer for them, and nor does anybody else, but the two great mystery questions that science faces are, what is information and what is consciousness? Because when people get information that hasn't been known, for instance, like locating an archaeological site that no one has known for thousands of years, where does that come from? Where does that information come from? And it isn't that they're just being precognitive, that is, they're describing something which in the future they will learn. And I know that because in 3 instances, people described in great detail locations and the things that would be found at that location, and then they died, so they never got any feedback. So it couldn't be precognition because they were not there by the time we discovered the things that they described. So see, I can't even ask the question properly. Where is that information is a spatial question.
Yeah.
But this is not spatial. So if consciousness is causal and fundamental, then what we call reality is actually a matrix of consciousness. And that changes the entire way you think about everything. Because if consciousness is causal and fundamental, then, for instance, just at a political level, you want to do everything you can to foster well-being at every level, from the bacteria in your soil to you and to the birds flying and, everything. Because when there is increased well-being, everybody prospers. So it changes your entire way of thinking about things. And even more than that, if you look at religion, you put aside the dogmas and all of that, whether there's one God, 2 gods, 3 gods, are they men, are they women, whatever. If you realize and you go back and look at it historically, what you discover is that all religions begin when one individual has a non-local consciousness experience.
Yeah.
Think about that. Jesus goes to John, who's baptizing people in the river, and he gets baptized. He's a Jew. They're all Jews or something else. And he awakens. He goes into the desert, it says, and he meditates. And he awakens. The Buddha goes to an ashram for a teacher and is taught to meditate, and he awakens. Muhammad goes to the sacred cave of Hira, and he meditates and awakens. So all of this begins when one guy, one woman, whatever, has a non-local consciousness experience and is sufficiently charismatic that when they talk about it, people listen. I mean, lots of people have these experiences, but a lot of them get dismissed as cranks, but not all of them. More than that, once you get the idea that consciousness is causal and fundamental, you understand why intentioned consciousness can change the well-being of other individuals or whatever. And research has shown that You can you can make bacteria die or grow. You can make plants grow or die. You can make individuals. That's where the whole idea
Well,
of curses and comes from, is that consciousness has the ability to alter the nature of reality.
so let me jump in there, because there was about 3 weeks ago now, there was an article in Foreign Policy entitled "Russia is Afraid of Western Psychic Attacks." And they were stating that Putin and the Kremlin are concerned about things like remote viewing, remote influence, and these elements of non-local consciousness. I mean, should they have concerns about this, or are they just, are they being silly, I guess?
Yes, I read the article in Foreign Policy. It is appallingly ill-informed, by the way, because it calls the whole thing pseudoscience and
Yes,
debunks
yes.
it.
It was very
So,
critical.
yes, because the woman that wrote the article has no idea what she's talking about. I was actually I don't subscribe to the Foreign Policy Journal, which, by the way, is one of the major geopolitical journals. I've actually written for them, but I was appalled that they published that article. But since I don't subscribe, they won't accept letters to the editor if you don't subscribe, and so I'm not going to anyway. Should they be concerned? That's not quite the right question. That's not quite way to put the question. Should they be concerned? Should anyone be concerned that individuals are beginning to awaken to the idea of the matrix of consciousness? If you think about it, in the United States, we have only one social priority, and that's profit. Greed and profit. That's what drives American society, right?
Yeah.
And because it's a materialist worldview, if you can make profit, even if you harm things, well, that's too bad. But you made all the profit. But if you think about it from the point of view, is consciousness causal and fundamental, then you realize that if you're polluting or you're creating toxicity at some level that's harming other things, then you are hurting the matrix of consciousness. And you are disrupting the equilibrium of the matrix, and you are setting in motion things that can do great damage, not only to those things that you're focused on, but also to the entire matrix of consciousness, and thus you get climate change. Climate change is the result of a materialist worldview in which profit and the exploitation of technologies to produce profit is causing what we're now facing. And what's happening is people are slowly beginning to awaken, particularly young people, because they recognize they're going to have to live in that world. And so the question the woman asked in the article in Foreign Policy is Russia concerned that the United States is doing this kind of research? Yeah, they probably are, because I don't know of any research being done. I think it's probably just reasonable that the government is doing some kind of research somewhere on the nature of consciousness to try to understand it. And so the Russians would be looking at the same thing. Yes, the Russians do have a highly mystical worldview, and Putin is part of it. I met Putin. He's a very cold guy, by the way. But there is it's part of Russian religion. It's part of the culture. They have a very mystical orientation in a certain way. And so are they concerned about this? Yeah, probably. But they're concerned about the wrong thing.
Yeah.
Because what they really ought to be concerned about is, are we doing things with our culture that are fostering well-being, or are we doing things that are harming well-being? And of course, the answer is the war in Ukraine. So they're doing horrible things, and it is having a huge negative effect on the Russian culture, society, because the intelligent, technologically sophisticated, educated people are leaving by droves. And
Yes.
so
Yeah.
part of their problem is not only that they can't get parts because they've been locked out of the international markets, but that they're losing the highly intelligent, sophisticated people who will create future technologies. So what Putin is doing, from 1981 to 1993, I spent a great deal of time in the Soviet Union. I started the 104th joint venture between the Soviet Union and the United States. I was part of the citizen diplomacy movement. I was one of the founders of it to try to create linkages between the United States and the Soviet Union. I had an apartment in Moscow. So I spent a lot of time there and came to like Russia. But unfortunately, the Russian culture for over 1,000 years has been authoritarian in nature. Czars, dictators, whatever. So that's sort of built into the culture's genetics, and they're now trapped in that again with Putin. I think that I believe if things continue to go downhill as they are, I think Putin's days are numbered, but it's going to be very traumatic, and it's going to affect Russia. The Russian economy is tied to gas and oil, and as we move out of the carbon era, countries are making a commitment by 2040, 2045. States in the United States, they won't have any carbon-powered vehicles on the road. So the whole economy, what's left of the Russian economy, is on the verge of collapse.
Well, yeah. So Stephen, and we're starting to run short on time, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask about the UAP issue also. Have you done any work on this issue? Do you have any insights? And again, the reason I ask is this is in the United States. This is probably the single most interesting, and it could be the most newsworthy item of 2023. So
yeah, okay. In 1973, I was invited by the American Anthropological Association to put on a seminar of what do we know about UAPs. And it was anthropologists. And I have been involved with this since the 1950s when I met Donald Kehoe, who was a friend of my mother's and who was one of the first people to write about UAPs. And I've known most of the major figures that, the MUFON founders and all those guys. So I've known this. It hasn't been you can't objectively verify everything. So it's been a kind of secondary issue for me because you can't. But I will give you what I think is going on. That's what
absolutely. Yeah,
that's
that
what
would be
you're
wonderful.
asking me. I think what's going on, it clearly is not about, as the movies all describe, it's not about conquering us or military or all of that stuff. I think what is going on, and I think the evidence is overwhelming, by the way, is that any planet with any species, not just Earth, but any planet, that develops technology gets to a point where the technology reaches a stage where it can either destroy the culture or they wake up and recognize the matrix of consciousness and they change the technologies and they thrive. And I think we are at that stage.
Okay.
And I think they've been watching us for quite a while. I had dinner with Arthur Kessler many years ago, a guy who was very interested in these subjects. You probably know who that is. Wrote a number of books. And Kessler pointed out something very interesting, and then he published it later in a book called Janus. But anyway, we were at dinner, and he said to me, what I think is going on is that they are trying to guide us to develop correctly. And I think that what caused the rising of Homo sapien from Neanderthal and the Denisovans is that they manipulated our genetics to create better coordination between the high brain, the midbrain, and the reptilian brain. And I thought that was really quite extraordinary. But then years later, I got to be friends with a guy named John Mack, who was doing all this abduction research. And I was talking to him about this, and I told him this story about Kessler and at dinner. And he said, well, I think you may be right. Because if you look at all the, and he had, of course, hundreds of these things. If you look at this abductee stuff, what you find over and over again is that they probed these people in their genitals, particularly women. So are they extracting eggs and genetically altering them and then reinserting them? Are they, whatever, I don't know, I mean, whatever, however they might be doing it, are they trying to help us get across this barrier or this
great filter, right?
This transition? We're at a point where our technology is literally destroying the planet.
Yeah.
Climate change. So the question is, are we going to destroy ourselves, or are we going to wake up to the fact that we are part of a matrix of consciousness, that consciousness is causal and fundamental, and that fostering well-being is what we should and must be doing.
Well,
so as a result of that, 18 years ago, I began to look at how do individuals and small groups change the course of history to create well-being, because if that is correct about the UAPs, and I think it is, they're just watching us. And they may be helping us, in ways with these abductees, I don't know. But they're watching us to see, is our technology going to destroy us? Or are we going to awaken to new technologies which support and foster well-being and survive and thrive?
And on that note, Stephan, let me thank you so much for your time today. I genuinely can't thank you enough. So let me close by asking, what comes next for you in the short term? And people can learn more about your work at StephanASchwartz.com. I will put links into the show notes for that. You've done a lot of predictive research also. We barely scratched the surface.
That's a whole other story.
Yeah. Well, and in the future, I would love to have you back to drill down on some of this. But I would definitely refer people to StephanASchwartz.com. I spent probably about 3 hours doing research with videos that you've published there. You have so much material, and it's all wonderful material. So what comes next for you, I guess? Let's go through that.
As I said, I'm like the UAPs. I'm interested in, do we survive? And are we going to learn to foster well-being, or are we going to destroy ourselves? Because the capability to do that exists. So in 1978, I began what is now a 45-year project, 45-year-long project, in which at that time, 78, I just left government. I had a little daughter who was 8 years old, and I wanted to know what her world would be like because of my concern about this. And I had started this research on, how do individuals and small groups change history in a good way. So I thought, well, I'll use remote viewing. So I started by asking people to describe the same day of the year in 2050. So if you were, for instance, a person I was interviewing, I would say to you, Tim, I want you to go forward in time to January the 28th, 2050. Tell me when you're in contact, what are you experiencing, and a bunch of questions. And so I began doing this. To my surprise, I began getting, again, this is the consensus protocol, this idea that you get multiple people and you're looking for where they agree, or low a priori, odd observations, things you wouldn't expect to get. I mean, for instance, I'll just give you, because I know you're running out of time, one example. When I left government, I'd been part of the geopolitical community for quite a while. I was part of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Secretary of Defense study group on innovation technology in the future. And I was convinced we were going to have a nuclear war. And so were most people, that if not by deliberation, by mistake. And in fact, we almost did have a nuclear war. It all got down to one Soviet colonel who wouldn't push the button. Otherwise, we would have had a third world war. He just wouldn't push the button. It turned out to be a mistake. Anyway, so I started with people, and my interest was, first of all, do we have a nuclear war that will destroy the world my little girl is in? And people said to me, no, we don't have a nuclear war. I said, oh, well, that's good. And I said, well, then the world must be much safer. And they said to me, no, the world is much more dangerous. I said, dangerous? Why? And they said, oh, well, because of terrorism. Now, in those days, 78, 79, the only terrorism was the fight between the Protestant and Catholics in Ireland, right? Or in Northern Ireland. And terrorism. And I said, well, then what's going on with the Soviet Union? And they said to me, well, it doesn't exist. I said, what? What do you mean it doesn't exist? It doesn't exist. And I went around to a friend of mine who was one of the leading geopolitical guys in the country, and I said to him, do you know anything that would cause the Soviet Union to disappear? This is 78, 79. And he said, oh, God, no. What are you talking about? You know, we got two superpowers, blah, 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 all the standard stuff. Well, of course, in 1991, Christmas Day, the Soviet Union ceased to exist.
Yeah.
And then I'll just give you one other. I said to them, well, tell me about health care. And they described that. I won't get into that. But they said to me, I said, well, is there any particular problem? And they said, oh, well, yes, pandemics. And I said, pandemics? What are you talking about? They said, well, the first one will be a blood disease that crosses over from primates to humans in Africa, and it's going to kill millions of people. And I went to a friend of mine who was the deputy director of National Institutes of Health and said to him, do you know anything about a blood disease that's starting in Africa, crossing over from primates to humans? And his answer was, Stephan, I don't know what you're smoking, but you should quit. Because, no, that's just nonsense. There's nothing. And, of course, in 81, here comes AIDS, HIV, crosses over from primates to humans, kills 35 million people. Then we get SARS. Then we get H5N1. And now we got COVID, killed over 1 million people. So I have continued that experiment. I'm now looking at 2060. And because I want to see what the difference between 2050 and 2060, and I will just leave you with one final thing, and that is between 2040 and 2045, something is going to happen which is so dramatic that it changes culture around the world. And I'm not sure what it is yet. I think it's a confluence of things, but I'm not sure. But 2040 to 2045 is going to be a existential change in human history.
Wonderful. Stephan, thank you again so much for your time today, sir.
Happy to do it.